Hi everyone. So this is the second part of 3 videos about how time and concepts of time impact our analysis of literature and storytelling. In the first video, we looked at how the choice to begin a story at a set point in time affects our understanding of it and our analysis of it. We considered 3 terms in media res and ultima res ab ovo as being 3 different methods for how to structure the beginning of a story and kind of the timing of it. So in media res means that you start the story in the middle of the story or in the middle of the kind of drama. And in ultima res means you end the story, or sorry, you begin the story with the ending of the story, and then you kind of backtrack and show how it led to that. And then there's ab ovo, which is you kind of begin where things are normal and settled and status quo, and then later on the drama, the action starts. So in particular, we considered how Hamlet and The Lion King, 2 very different works of storytelling, but ones with very similar basic stories, right? So the son avenging the death of the father a king who's killed by his brother and the son's uncle. But their beginnings are completely different. Their ways of using time and the effect that that has on the audience is completely different because one begins um, before the death of the king and one begins after. And just that choice affects meaning. So today we're going to continue that, but now we're going to focus not just on how it affects meaning, why it's good to focus on concepts of time, but really how we can take our focus on concepts of time and create good discussion questions out of it, which will hopefully lead to good writing, which is our focus for the third video. So let's get into it.
Now, to be clear, to begin in the beginning doesn't mean that you begin with the birth of the hero. I'm going to give you 2 examples where that is the case. And in fact, chapter 1 of this example, David Copperfield, literally is called I Am Born, right? So you can't get any more ab ovo than that. But again, ab ovo could be not necessarily the birth of the character, but the status quo, that you start before all the drama begins. So if we had started with like teenage Hamlet getting to know his uncle and his father and thinking about his place in the kingdom, and then a few scenes later the murder happens while Hamlet's away, that could still have been an ab ovo beginning for Hamlet. It doesn't have to be I Am Born. But I'm giving you these examples because I Am Born is such a good example of ab ovo that it will help out. So let's read the beginning of David Copperfield. This is one of Dickens's most famous novels. It's a humongous text, and yeah, because it begins with this birth, and it tells you the whole kind of life story of this character. So, famous first lines: whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike and I began to cry simultaneously. In consideration of the day and hour of my birth, it was declared by the nurse and by some sage women in the neighborhood who had taken a lively interest in me several months before there was any possibility of our becoming personally acquainted, first, that I was destined to be unlucky in life, and secondly, that I was privileged to see ghosts and spirits, both these gifts inevitably attaching, as they believed, to all unlucky infants of either gender born towards the small hours on a Friday night. So we have a first-person narration here. This is the main character talking about, what happened the night of his birth. Now here is a much different text, but there's some connection here. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, which, yes, it tells the story of a young man, not unlike what Dickens is doing with David Copperfield. But you can see from the very beginning, chapter 1, we are dealing with a baby. The character's name is Stephen Dedalus. But the way that Joyce begins is much different than what Dickens does. So it begins like this. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tuckoo. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. So obviously this is a bit less straightforward than the previous scene, the Dickens one. But if we look at it closely, we can see what's going on. This first line, once upon a time, and a very good time it was, is what Stephen's father is likely saying to baby Stephen, right? He's telling him a story about a moo cow and a baby boy. And so it starts with kind of like the narration, but it doesn't tell you that it's the father. So it almost seems like this once upon a time is both the beginning of this book, but also the beginning of the father's story that's being told to the baby. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. So I could be misreading this. It could be his father's in the hospital and he's in the nursery and he's looking at him through the glass. I don't know. It could be he's got glasses on. This clearly, he's a baby and his father is a man and he's got a beard. So it's kind of the first impressions that Stephen has as a baby. But what you can see is both of these are kind of like the quintessential ab ovo beginning. Like this, you can't get any more, like David says here, to begin my life with the beginning of my life, to begin with the beginning. That's what ab ovo does. So now how do we take this writing, and turn it into good, close reading analysis that both produces good discussion and that produces good writing? So what we want to do is, you're always thinking, how can I ask good questions about something that I'm reading closely? So discussion questions work well when they're both broad and specific. And I know that's a contradiction, but what that means is it should be broad enough that it can produce a lot of different possible answers, right? So if it's, if the question is just, is this an ab ovo beginning, an in media res beginning, or an ultima res beginning, that's a multiple choice question. It's not a discussion question. There's one answer. So there should be multiple possibilities to a good discussion question, but it has to be narrow enough that, you know what happens in a discussion when you ask something that's too broad, people just stare at each other for 10 minutes. So it's got to be specific enough that people can really zoom in and come up with something helpful. So here's what you can do to find good discussion questions that involve close reading in relation to time in a narrative. So first, ask questions about the role of time at the beginning of a story. So just like we've done here, again, it's not just identifying. You don't want to just say, is it 1, 2, or 3? Media, ultima, ovo. The question should be more analytical. So assume that your group can figure out which of the 3 it is, or you can start by just, start with the multiple choice question. Which one of the 3 is it? And once you've figured that out, now go in for the real discussion question. Why? Why did the author choose to begin in media res? What effect does it have? Okay, so you can't go wrong with this because every storyteller has to begin somehow. And so, you can't begin without a beginning. And so the point here is you can apply this to almost anything, if not anything. And then go back to our other terms, analepsis, prolepsis. Whenever you see the narrator jump ahead in time, jump back in time, ask questions about that. And remember that these things are more complicated as I'm trying to show you. So Flashbacks are pretty obvious, right? Like 10 years ago, this happened. And the author, the filmmaker will make sure you know that this is happening in reverse, in a flashback. Flash forwards are a little bit, you would think that they don't happen as often, but in a way, flash forwards happen more than anything because stories, even chronological stories, they don't tell you every single thing that happened, right? So a narrator always has to cut out time and jump ahead. And sometimes they jump ahead to the next hour, and sometimes they jump ahead to 2 weeks later, and sometimes they jump ahead to the next day. And so you can always ask questions about that. So even if something's chronological and they're not showing you 20 years in the future, why does an author choose to jump ahead an hour as opposed to a day? Why does an author choose to jump ahead, maybe 2 weeks? And so the way that they organize time is something that you can always ask that why question of why did they do that? Why did they cut out this amount of time to move forward? And then you can always ask questions that involve time and then comparisons to other things. Just like we did with Hamlet and The Lion King, comparing things, even if Hamlet is one of, if not the greatest play ever written, and The Lion King, don't get me wrong, it's wonderful, but it's not Hamlet. Even if they're not of the same quality, their connections, putting them aside one another, do bring out certain things by way of comparison. And in the case of time, I think it's interesting to do that. So compare use of time between texts, but you could also just compare the use of time between two scenes in the same book. And then you can, ask questions about time across concepts. So what I mean by that is, how does a first-person narrative differ from a third-person narrative when it comes to, say, analepsis? So if you recall, analepsis is going back in time. Well, when David Copperfield is telling you the story of his life, and he says here, as I have been informed and believe, we're now reading this imagining that there's an adult David Copperfield who is telling us a story that happened already. So is the whole story a flashback then? And who's this adult that's talking to us now? Is it the adult at the end of the story, or is he going to get to a present time at some point? And those are questions we can ask. And it's not always, the narrator is telling you their first person story from a distant perspective, right? Like sometimes they could be telling it in present time. This is happening to me now. This is obviously the voice, though, of somebody who is already having lived the events of the story. But again, we don't know where in the timeline he is. So if you saw the movie Forrest Gump, he's beginning the movie on a park bench or a bus stop, and he's telling the story to people who are waiting for the bus. At a certain point, his bus finally shows up. And so he's narrated the first, say, hour and a half. But then the story catches up to his narration, and we see what happens after it, and he doesn't know what's going to happen next. So for the first hour and a half, he's the narrator who knows what's happened. But for the remainder of the movie, he doesn't know what will happen, and we don't know what will happen. So neither the audience nor the narrator knows how the story will end. And that's different from, say, a narrator who's writing or telling you the story after everything is already over. And so questioning that creates interesting things. And now the idea is can we take those questions, lend themselves to whatever, we are reading at the time, create discussion out of that, and then move from discussion to writing. You might have to write an essay, you might have to do some kind of, written response. And so your goal is to always view this as being part of the same process. You don't want it to just be, I'm discussing for no reason and I'm writing for no reason. We read, we annotate, we discuss, we write, and those things are all interconnected. So if I come up with questions now about my two readings based on these generic, kind of tips, I might come up with something like, what does Dickens' choice to begin at the beginning suggest about the relationship between birth and one's future? Okay, so this is a question really asking, why did Dickens choose to begin with an ab ovo beginning? What effect does it have? What meaning does it produce? So that's one more specific version of one of these questions. Second, how does Dickens' choice of narrator introduce a sense of prolepsis and analepsis, even if he's narrating in present time and ab ovo? What effect does this have on the reader? So, meaning, like I just said, because we know that the narrator of the story is not baby David Copperfield, but it has to be adult David Copperfield, we know that the narrator is flashing back for us. At the same time, we're focused on the baby. We're focused on what's happening in the story that's being told to us. But it also gives a sense of prolepsis because we have to now think of the baby growing up. And so this choice of narrator creates both a past sense because we know that this has already happened, but a future tense because we have to imagine the character we're reading about as a grown-up too. So what effect does that have? What does that do for us as a reader? That's an interesting question to be thinking about, how a first-person narrator, kind of messes with our sense of time. And then 3, let's do the comparison. So how does James Joyce's narrative choice to begin at the beginning differ from Dickens's choice? So both of them begin at the beginning, but they do it in different ways with different, kind of sensibilities. So let's see, if in answering some of these questions, we can produce kind of the beginnings of good writing.